Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today. My name is Gareth Jones. I'm the Director of International Enrollment, Recruitment, and Market Development at Douglas College, and here with my colleague Daniel.
And my name's Daniel Zeldin. My title is almost as long as Gareth's. It's Associate Director of International Strategic Enrollment at Camosun College. Thanks for joining us today.
So, some of the topics we're going to go over today, we'll do a quick overview of what we'll be diving into, and three main topics: ethical, marketing, and promotion. The second, working with education agents or consultants. And the third topic, how to support students from the first point of contact. And at the end, we did in our live discussion have a group discussion. So we'll touch on some of the topics that were discussed at that time. So moving on.
So basically, how did we get to where we are today in international education here in Canada? I know the easy answer is, well, IRCC policy changes. Yes, that was obviously a big part of it, but let's backtrack a little bit. So the policy changes were a response to a problem caused by too much growth too quickly. Although in some parts of Canada and some parts of BC specifically, that growth may have been sustainable, it wasn't in other places. And the policy responses were applied across the country, obviously. So what happened was essentially for a while we had too much growth in one or two source countries in particular. And then we had this strong drive for diversification. And with that strong drive for diversification, our numbers multiplied and multiplied and multiplied to the point where, like I mentioned, in many communities, the situation did become a bit unsustainable. How did a lot of institutions do diversification? Some had regional recruiters, others did online marketing, and others went the route of agent aggregators or sub-agent networks, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the presentation. So the purpose of the new IE Code of Practice really is to help hold institutions accountable for what's being promised to students, either by the institution directly or by agents and sub-agents. So really it's a guide for us to really understand how it is that we need to present information about our institution, about our communities, and real opportunities for students, and to ensure that we're upholding that code of practice right across the spectrum. In terms of what we're planning to do differently with the new code, Gareth and I will walk you through some of the examples of what we've been doing. In our presentation at the symposium, we really had a very engaging and dynamic presentation, and a lot of other institutions shared their practices as well. So we'll try to build in a few of the examples from other institutions as we go forward through the presentation.
Thanks, Daniel. So moving on to the first main topic, ethical marketing and promotion. What we've done here is pull the language directly from the EQA International Education Code of Practice. Now, we're not going to read through this whole thing. I think anyone can do that on their own time. But having read this, essentially we had a few major themes that emerged, which are shown here. And let's start with transparency and honesty. And I'll just pass it over to Daniel. We'll go back and forth to give some input on these topics here.
So if you have a quick glance at this list, none of this is going to be foreign to you. We've all heard about the accommodation crisis in Canada. So obviously one of the main points to be addressed here is housing. So what are institutions doing to address the realities about housing options in their community? What do vacancies look like? How much does it cost? And also very importantly, what are some tenancy rights? So the big point here is ensuring that students know what they're getting into. They know what they need to spend, they know what the availability looks like, and they know where they have rights and where they may need to adapt as well.
Yeah, and for all of us that are often on the road and we are recruiting and we're meeting with students directly, something to consider is students, when they want to get that true information, that transparency and honesty, sometimes that needs to come from peers. And we do have some examples to share later on, but keep in mind that there is an opportunity for students to discuss their opportunities in Canada at your institution by discussing with some of the students that are currently studying at the institution. Another thing to keep in mind is making sure program information is is clear. It's very visible online. And one of the things that we have learned and one of the best practices we've come across is it's important to show students that there are some labor market outlooks. There's some information there for students to see what their ultimate outcome is from the programs that they're studying. And thanks to all the policy changes that took place in 2024, a lot of us have had to update our program information with zip codes, something that I think a lot of us were probably unfamiliar with a few months ago. So essentially, by putting the zip codes there, students can see whether those programs they want to apply to are eligible for the postgraduate work permit. So again, making sure that information is visible, it's easy to find, students can navigate and understand what they're getting into before they come to Canada.
Yeah, and another big piece that we've included here is we don't work in sales. We don't deal with widgets. We're not in manufacturing. We deal with human beings. And I think this is a really important point within this theme of not blurring our line of sight. We work with students who are investing large amounts of money to develop this life project, really, that they want to build in Canada. So I think it's really important for us to ensure that we're not ever losing sight of that. And one of the best ways to do it is to be 100% honest and forthcoming. I know it's very tempting to, try to find ways to say, it's going to cost you a little bit less if you do it this way or that way. Students will figure that out on their own. But I think they need to have the full panorama, and they need to have a very clear understanding of what it will take them to build on their project and to work towards their academic and career goals here in Canada. So I know, in our industry, working with agencies that are businesses and have bottom lines and are looking at dollars and cents, it's hard to try to change the vocabulary we're using. But I think it's really important that when thinking about this line of sight and who we're working with, we're thinking in terms of we don't work in sales, we're working in advising, we're working in supporting students in accomplishing a project and in accomplishing a dream that they may have here in Canada.
Yeah, and looking at the second theme that emerged from this information we've extracted from the code of practice is cultural sensitivity and inclusivity. And I would say that a lot of the institutions that we communicate with here in British Columbia, especially the larger ones, will have a fairly large staff with multiple languages, multiple cultures available for students. So something to keep in mind, this is just a key element that we need to consider, having multilingual staff with intercultural awareness, whether that's on the admissions side and or the advising side.
Absolutely. And the other piece is when we're designing collateral, marketing materials, I know it might seem a little bit obvious, but I see so much material that looks very, very Canadian and not very specific to the different environments that you're in. Let's please remember who we're trying to speak to. If you're developing collateral that's focused on parents, let's use language that's inclusive for parents. If you're trying to develop online content, social media campaigns focused on xenials, let's try to develop content that's really, having them in mind, and we're in a way that's able to engage them really effectively. And of course, as Gareth just mentioned about multilingual staff, think a little bit about the language question. I'm not. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong answer in terms of whether or not you should translate materials. I think there are very strong arguments for doing it and for not doing it. But again, think about who you're trying to connect with. If you're really trying to work with a group of students who are very proficient in language, in the English language, then probably having English language materials is more effective. But if you really want to focus on parents who may not have very strong abilities in English, then it might be worthwhile considering creating translations for them too.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And in fact, it's something we're looking at Douglas College is, in fact, in addition to our flyers that are translated into about 10 different languages, we would like to have what we call a parent guide. So something that's designed more specifically with that target audience being the parents in multiple languages. Yeah, and looking at the third theme that emerged, the legal and regulatory compliance. So one thing we've been able to do at Douglas College, and I think we're privileged in being a relatively large institution that we do have some flexibility here, is we saw that a number of policy changes were taking place, and we suspected many more were going to take place. So there's a lot more, I suppose, eyes from the government side on our practices. And so what we've actually been able to do is create a new position, someone who's 100% committed to following and looking at compliance-related topics, being that go-to person for EQA, for IRCC, for ministry contacts. Now, for those of you that work at smaller institutions, perhaps the budget's not there to add a full-time equivalent, someone dedicated to this work. Perhaps some of the jobs or a job could be, the job description could be updated to include eyes on compliance. So something to keep an eye on as you go forward to make sure that not only you're maintaining your compliance, but you've got someone with eyes on it at all times.
Absolutely, yeah. Here at Camosun, we've done the same thing. We've actually, and we haven't been able to create a new position for someone to do this oversight, but the compliance piece has been built into certain job descriptions. So it's really a matter of making sure that we're all walking the walk and not just talking the talk when it comes to implementing this new IA code of practice. The last point here, just really quickly. Spot checks. One of the big questions that comes up is the how. How are we going to implement this? In some ways, it's going to be much clearer than others. Full disclosure, we certainly don't have all the answers, and part of what we were doing at the symposium was trying to draw ideas as a group and find ways to come up with solutions as a sector and really come out very strong as an education sector here in BC in particular to demonstrate that we are being compliant. But one of these bits is spot checks. Maybe think about different ways how you can build into your processes. Reaching out to students and maybe conducting surveys and try to find out a little bit more about their journey on the way to your institution. Were they provided with adequate information about housing? Were the marketing materials sufficient in terms of helping them make a decision? Did they have easy access to staff members at your institution? The agencies or agent who they worked with, were they quick to respond to them? Did they provide full and accurate information to the student? I think it's helpful to do these checks kind of regularly and see where you're at. I mean, you could certainly use it as a way of monitoring agent performance for sure, but I think it's also important to use this as a way to ensure that you're upholding your end of regulatory compliance.
Yeah, and moving on, we've just got a few examples. So starting here with Camosun College.
Yeah, so just very quickly here, as you can see, one thing we have on a number of our program pages, and we're trying to build it out onto a lot more of them. Provide some examples as to how much you can earn after graduating from a particular program, some ideas of jobs or career paths that you can take coming out of that program as well. And in terms of housing resources, some institutions will have in-house housing departments. So you might have your own homestay program. You might have student residences. In other cases, you may not. In our case, we don't currently. We do have a plan to have residents in the very near future, but we don't currently. So what we do is we provide as many resources as we can to students. So links to estimated costs of living, costs of rents, links to the BC Tenancy Act, and so on, and invite students to connect with us or connect with peers to gain more information on this.
Yeah, and similarly at Douglas College, we, as an institution, depending on the faculty, I suppose some will provide more information than others. We are, I would say, pretty good at providing that transparency, that information that students are looking for. What are the career pathways? So the example we've got here is the Early Childhood Education Diploma at Douglas College. So you can see the list of career opportunities. Down below, we have some links to some surveys and BC student outcomes, all very useful information for students to browse through and really get a better sense of what it is they're getting into. Yeah, and there's all kinds of opportunity. There are other statistics out there. We can link to Stats Canada. We could link to Work BC to find this information. So anywhere where it's possible to provide students with further information is certainly encouraged. And as we were discussing earlier regarding multiple languages, being cognizant that we are speaking to folks from around the world, this is just a list of our current brochures that we have in different languages. And I believe we have 10 at this time. And these are from our key markets where we have some of the bigger populations. Now, I think if we had more resources, we could certainly add additional languages here. And as I said, I think a parent guide is something that could be considered as well. So let's move on to the next main topic, which is working with education consultants or agents. And as I did previously, we've pulled some information directly from the EQA Code of Practice and highlighted a few things here that when Daniel and I were talking about this and preparing for the presentation, and when we speak to our peers across British Columbia, these bullets that have been highlighted are the areas where we felt like we needed a bit more attention. I would say for the most part, especially at Douglas College, we've been recruiting ethically, especially when it comes to our agent network. And I do have another slide that I'll go over some, I guess it's a case study where we actually went through an audit back in 2018, which actually prepared us quite well for this new code of practice. But some of the things that come up are, what are the corrective actions that could take place? I mean, there's all kinds of things we could do, but perhaps as an industry, and part of our discussion actually at the symposium was what are some of the things we could come up with to encourage agents to be compliant. The other one is, and this is fairly new, is we have to ensure that the agents we work with have their own contract with their students, with the prospective students. Now, this is not necessarily something we can enforce. I mean, we can certainly put it in our contracts and ask that agents follow this. And I suppose if we find out that they're not, that's when the corrective actions would take place. And we have to ensure that immigration advice is being given legally, so only in cases where the agents are licensed to provide that information. So, and one of the things that came up here is being proactive. How do we be proactive in as opposed to being reactive, which I think a lot of us typically do in this industry. We wait for something to happen and then we take action. But I think knowing that there are more eyes on this sector, there's a certain amount of compliance we have to follow, there is a need to be more proactive on this. So some of the themes that have come from this, which I've touched on a bit already, and some of these are best practices. It's really quite important to have your own agreement. So there are agencies out there, some of the bigger ones, the global agents, where they will insist on signing their contract. But the best practice is have a standard contract within your institution whenever possible. I touched on this earlier, the student agent agreements. Ensure that that language is clear to the agent network and that they do have those agreements with students. It's important to do reference checks. This is something that is a best practice across the industry. I would say typically, we being located in Canada, we would prefer to have references from institutions that are also within Canada, better yet within BC. Now, we know this isn't always possible, but whenever it is possible, we do recommend to do that. Perhaps, Daniel, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll jump in here and add a little bit. So, yeah, I think as Gareth mentioned, it's more a matter of being proactive as opposed to being reactive. So I think a lot of us have very solid contracts, similar to what Gareth mentioned. We have very good practices in place. I think we've always had a very good system in place to recruit very ethically, and we've had a very good contract with appropriate termination clauses and all of that. But a big piece here is I feel like that's all very, reactive. So something's gone wrong, and now we're going to address it, and there's going to be punishment. A big part of what we need to do is think about what our selection processes are in the first place to bring an agent on. So yeah, as Gareth mentioned, to do reference checks, I think that's really important. I think another big piece is to maybe have some type of, I know some institutions have some type of a test or quiz or onboarding, a more formal onboarding process for agents to make sure that they're aware of how the institution works and what some of the rules are. And I would certainly build in information about the IE Code of Practice as well. And just provide sort of more education more generally about what all of this means and what all of this is going to imply in terms of an agent's interactions with students. And then that sort of segues into this next point about corrective actions, right? So, what do we do in case there's a violation of contract terms? Do you jump to termination clauses? Do you, jump in and do further training? Do you do suspensions? Have a plan in place. Have a plan in place, have an appropriate response mechanism just in case. But let's think a little bit more along the lines of what we can do to prevent problems from happening in the first place. The next point is agent aggregators, and I know this is a very, very big question. We brought it up as a discussion topic in the end, but I'm going to draw in a few of these points here. So again, going back to the theme of not blurring our line of sight to students, one of the big questions that came up as agent aggregators really came onto the scene more assertively, let's say, during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic era was, okay, you're working with this one particular company who's working with a network of potentially thousands of sub-agents. So you as an institution don't necessarily know who's providing advice or support to students and what that advice or support is looking like. So going back to that previous point about being proactive, what mechanisms can you possibly have in place to ensure that these sub-agents are working in a particular manner? I think this is really important to keep in mind. there was a big discussion we had, and I'll invite Gareth to jump in with some points that he had. But I'll say that we don't generally work with agent aggregators. We typically try to work with agents who have representation in market, and they have a physical office for the most part, and they're able to meet with students and parents physically. And some people might think that this is a little bit more of an outdated concept, with virtual meetings being totally possible. And yeah, of course, I know a lot of companies are certainly comfortable with meeting online, meeting virtually, and all that too. And we certainly don't tell anybody that they can't do it. But there is a degree of legitimacy and a degree of seriousness that a company has when they have a physical location. There's some accountability there, and I feel that helps a lot with that direct line of sight. We know where the agent is, where they're working from, and what image they're projecting to their students and to their clients, so to speak, from there as well. So that's one thing to think about. When you add that extra layer, all of a sudden, we don't know where those people are. Now, a lot of people mention that some agent aggregators actually have very good compliance mechanisms in place, and they have screening processes, and they have ways to ensure that some of their sub-agents, some of their contractors are working in an ethical way. This is something for each institution to evaluate and determine if it is going to meet their own compliance standards, and if it's going to meet the IE Code of Practice as well. I'll turn it over to Gareth if you have any further comments on this. I know it's a big topic and a lot came up here. So.
Yeah, no, you've articulated that very well. I think it's clear agent aggregators they play an important role in recruitment and increasing diversity at certain institutions. So in some cases, it may be one of those things where they're not necessary, but they certainly add to the diversity, and it would be difficult to increase your diversity without them. That said, some of the pieces of advice we can give, best practices, if you are going to use with an aggregator, you have to ensure that that aggregator understands that the contract is between the institution and that aggregator, and anything that's done outside that agent is liable. So the contract must be secure, must be strong, must be aligned with the code of practice. Another recommendation we would suggest is asking for the list of sub-agents from those aggregators. Now, this is dynamic and it's fluid, and these aggregators are often adding and losing sub-agents. So it's something that you can't necessarily keep your eyes on at all times, but the suggestion would be at least annually to get an updated list of the sub-agents that work for the aggregators. And moving on, we did touch on training. The more that the agents are engaged, whether it's training or just through a communications plan, the better, I suppose, performance you're going to get. And it's more likely that the agents are going to remain compliant. And one of the things we could recommend here is, if you do have internal teaching platforms, for instance, at Douglas College, we do use Blackboard. So it's something we intend to look at and implement as a way of onboarding agents, whether that's at the outset for the new contract or when renewals come up. So again, regular training, regular contact, and something a little more interactive like a quiz would be recommended.
I will just jump in here and say I know this is one of the biggest challenges for many institutions. A lot of agencies that we work with have high turnover rates, and I know it becomes challenging to ensure that all of the counselors are up to speed with everything. Some agencies do have great internal mechanisms for ensuring they do training, but yeah, as Gareth mentioned, look at what resources you have available at your institution that you can implement and create sort of dynamic and engaging training, and be creative here. Think what you can do to really make sure that you're getting certain messages across, and you're being proactive in that messaging.
Okay. Yeah, looking ahead here, I mentioned earlier about a process we went through at Douglas College back in 2018, and it was requested or recommended that part of our international office had to go through an audit. And the idea that emerged after discussions with our VP at the time and the managers and directors was, well, let's look at our agent processes. And so we went through that process, and I guess no one really likes to be audited. But at the end of the day, what came of it was a very solid contract, an onboarding and monitoring SOP, standard operating procedure. So our contract, although ethical, I will say I was lucky. I began working at an institution that was already doing ethical marketing and recruitment, but there were things lacking. And so our agent contract, initially being 2 pages with 10 sections, this was pre-2018, grew to 11 pages and 20 sections with multiple subsections, including a code of ethics. And some of the topics within that code of ethics I've listed here, including integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, transparency, confidentiality, professional behavior, professionalism, and purpose. And interestingly, a lot of these topics are now appearing in the IE Code of Practice. So I am thankful we went through this because it actually prepared us quite well for updating our contract again. Now, having gone through this and having a solid contract, with the new Code of Practice, we are still lacking a few things, which I've pointed out at the bottom of this slide. Another thing that we initiated or that came out of this audit was we would not recruit a student through an agent unless there was a contract in place. So we went through all the due diligence, the reference checks, and we would offer a 1-year contract. And in a way, we saw that as a probation. So let's see how the agent performs. Let's see if this agent is compliant, follows our processes. And if that's the case, if they are successful, we will then consider a renewal of 3 years. In our SOP, we do have lists of how to monitor performance. We also ensure that there's privacy protection, which is embedded in the contract as well. But as I said, the contract's not perfect, and we will be updating with more detail on corrective actions and making sure specifically it's specified that the agent and student have their own contract. And although it's a little bit hard to read on the right, the graphic there, just to give you an idea, as we went through the audit, we did the whole flow chart of how this is going to work. So we're actually in the process of going through that again. And I do, as I did in the symposium, I invite anyone who's watching here today at this time to feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to share my experience and how the audit went and how it's going now, and perhaps we could share best practices going forward.
Yeah, and I will just jump in and say, I know a lot of you are probably reviewing your contracts at this point and reviewing your processes, but if you're not, do so, and do so with the new IE Code of Practice right next to you. So you're ensuring that you're building in a lot of these, or all of these new components.
Yeah, it's a significant amount of work, but we have to do it. And it is important. And I have to give credit to Daniel. The idea that he came up with is, we're all informing our agent network about this new Code of Practice. It may come across as, oh, it's one more thing for them to think of, But there is a way to leverage this in a positive way, in that if agents are recruiting students to British Columbia, they are ensured that they are recruiting students to a province that follows ethical marketing and recruitment because we have this code of practice. So we can really leverage that as a marketing tool itself.
Absolutely. Students will be feel far safer in knowing that they're working with a consultant and they're working with an institution that's following a provincial code of practice here. So yeah, at this point, so what are some things that we can do to support students? I know a lot of the topics that come up around student support are really focused on current students, but I think it's really, really important for us to remember that student support really starts when we establish that very first points of contact with students. Everything we've talked about in terms of marketing materials, in terms of how we're presenting ourselves as an institution, the agencies or consultants we're working with overseas, all of that image, all of that sort of ethical framework that we're creating, we're all creating it with supporting students in mind. So what are some things that we can do to really help support students from that point of first contact? Have excellent resources available. Have videos. One thing that we started to do a few years ago was kind of DIY type videos, how-to videos. Put them up on YouTube, keep them short and sweet, and it's kind of a step-by-step process that students can follow or consultants can follow, and it helps you in the long run because instead of answering this question maybe 10 or 20 or 30 times, you can refer individuals to these links, and in a 3-minute tutorial they can find all of this information. Yeah, other pieces, some of us have tuition fee calculators up on our websites, or we have more or less accurate tables. Good communication. I can't emphasize this point enough. Quick turnaround time. Be available on multiple channels. I know a lot of us really want to default to email. Not everybody uses email anymore, and especially in the younger generations, right? We can't lose sight of that. So, be present on multiple social networks. Have different chats available. Just be mindful of where your students are. Be mindful of your audience, and connect with them on their platforms and in their way, and be honest, be transparent, and be clear in your communication. The one other point I really wanted to mention here is this question of the right fit. As we're all experiencing enrollment challenges in this framework of all the policy changes, there might be this sort of pressure to really, okay, well, there's a student, okay, let's accommodate this student right away. You're not doing anyone any favors by doing that. You really need to work to make sure that the student is the right fit. The student needs to know that they're the right fit, what they're getting into, what they're signing up for, and you as an institution really need to ensure that you have an understanding about what you're offering, and that offering works with the student. So, and the same concept applies for working with consultants or agents. There are going to be consultants out there who really are going to understand your institution well, your destination well, and are going to do a great job at representing you. There are other consultants who are out there who might have really good strengths and really good knowledge sets in other areas, but your institution might not be the right fit for them. Their students, their market might not align with yours. So let's keep that piece in mind too.
Yeah, and just to give some, I guess, real life examples regarding the tuition fee calculator, thankfully, we recently launched that at Douglas College. That was an initiative through our marketing office, and it's been very useful. So an international student can go online, choose the program, the start date, and see how much they would have to be paying over the next year. Now, the next stage of this course would be, okay, the tuition is one thing, but what are the costs of living? So ideally, if you can, as an institution, add more variables, but of course, the more variables you add, the more complicated it can be. But it is something to consider. What are some other fees that the students would expect to pay? So housing, um, day-to-day fees, books, etc. And the other thing I wanted to point out is an initiative we in our international office started a few years ago was making sure that students inform us and we have up-to-date information on their study permit confirmation. So we do have a form that students must fill out by a certain deadline. We make those deadlines very clear on our website and in our offer letters. So the students are aware that they need to inform us whether they have their study permit or not, whether we have to defer them or not. So again, having that information available from the start and making it easy for students is very useful. And then the last point here is having strong engagement. And both Camosun and Douglas have student ambassador platforms. We have slightly different models, but these are great tools. And we did touch on this, and we'll touch on it a bit more, but great tools for students to reach out and get that information they may not be getting from the recruiters or from the admissions team. And then pre-departure orientation. This is a key to ensure students are ready and they have all the information they need before they come to Canada. And just moving on, if we look at some examples of the peer-to-peer engagement. So at Douglas College, we use Unibuddy. And essentially, students will go onto our international website. A little pop-up will appear, and students can choose to chat with peers from their home country, if available, and or a student that's enrolled in a program they're interested in studying themselves. So these interactions are wonderful. The prospective students can get information on the program. Perhaps they need to know a bit more about where to find the food that they normally eat, which as the recruiter, we may not have that information. Are there places where they can get their haircut that we're not aware of? That's different from what we're used to. And I mean, that's the one piece. The other piece, of course, is as these interactions take place, we can look at the most common questions that are asked of our ambassadors. And from that information, we can glean and use that information to better produce our marketing material. So we know what the students are looking for, we know what they're asking, and therefore we can put that information on our marketing material. And the red circle you can see there, since we launched in November 2021, we've answered over 32,000 questions. So it's quite clear to us. Our team is quite proud of this engagement. It's been useful on a number of levels. It ensures students get the information they need. It allows us to better target our marketing materials, and just provides a much more transparent experience for our prospective students.
Our experience has been very similar. We're currently using the Ambassador platform, and it's been fantastic. I think one of the main points here that I always emphasize is, we can talk to students as much as we want as recruiters, or agents or consultants can talk to students as much as they want from their perspective, very sort of in-depth knowledge of the programs and the experience and so on and so forth. But honestly, there is nothing like a peer-to-peer interaction. It's very authentic, it's very real, in the sense that this is what our future students will be experiencing. One other thing I want to mention here, there are lots of different ways to build an effective student ambassador program. One of the philosophies that we've really adopted at Camosun is we don't pay student ambassadors, and it's not because we refuse to pay them, it's because it's a philosophical question that as soon as we start paying students to do something, it becomes a job. We invite student ambassadors to volunteer and have, a heart-to-heart and honest conversation with the future student about their own experience. They have no obligation to stay on for any period of time, for, a month or a semester or a year or whatever. They stay as much or as little time as they want. And the idea is that they're just committed to sharing and to having those conversations. They are not responsible for having any conversations about admissions processes or an application process. I think these points are really important to make clear in your onboarding with the student ambassadors. Yeah, having those interactions is great. And then the long-term effects are also fantastic, because future students, when they decide to come, and I should mention that the conversion rates are very high as students are begin to engage on these platforms. We've fairly consistently had a conversion rate of around 8% or so for students, future students who have yet to pay a deposit or even apply, engaging on one of these platforms, to fully enrolling at the institution and starting their program. So it's very high, it's very effective. And yeah, ultimately, what I was going to mention was future students will have some contacts when they come too. So not only will they have all that information about housing and real costs and things like that, they'll have somebody who typically they can contact. Usually they share contact information at some point in their interactions. I've also included here just an example of our How to Apply to Camosun College tutorial. Yeah, this is just one example of the video resources we put out there. Another thing that sort of overlaps both of these are YouTube videos that our students have created about their life in Victoria, and I love watching these because there's so many things that I don't think of, right? Like the whole concept of public library, and the fact that you can get all these movies at a public library, and you can take out books for sometimes unlimited periods of time, and it costs nothing, and in lots of parts of the world this doesn't exist. Yeah, that's one thing that's exciting. Another thing that's come up is a lot of students who we have come from tropical countries where they might be used to eating a lot of mango or papaya or other types of tropical fruit, which, as you know, here in BC is outrageously expensive, particularly sometimes of the year. So, one of the things I talk about is, well, I still want my mango smoothie in the morning, but I discovered frozen mango, right? And so things that we don't really think about are just kind of automatic for us. It's really interesting to hear it from the student's perspective, and it's gone so far in terms of the future student engagement as well.
So that covers the three main themes we wanted to go over. But before we wrap up, just some resources here. As Daniel and I were going through this presentation, doing our due diligence, talking about where we got resources in the past, where we could get them going forward. I mean, always best to start local. So BCCIE, great place to start. They do have a guide to comprehensive international student support. CBIE has its own code of ethical practice. When it comes to working with agents, ISAF is the kind of industry standard, I would say, in terms of looking at training. ISAF has its own training program for agents, which is something you could consider as a requirement or not. And then looking outside, I suppose ISAF is an international company, but also looking outside, looking south to our neighbors down south in the US. AIRC is the American International Recruitment Council. Very good resource for agency standards and ethics. NAFSA is another one. NACAC has a guide to ethical practice in college admission. And then if you really want to go look even further, Australia has always been a good resource in terms of international education and its standards and its practices. So this is one link that we have here, the Australian International Education and Training Code of Ethics. Sorry for the typo there. I see two A's in education. So again, when you're looking at your own internal documents and your own processes, important to consider what we have locally, but also what exists out there in the world as well. And that brings us to the end. We did have, I mean, our discussion was, sorry, our presentation was quite long. We did have some discussions throughout, and these were the main topics, the main questions we had at the end. And as Daniel mentioned, the aggregator was the main piece that we discussed at the end, and that was brought up in the presentation already.
Yeah, and just on these other points, we were hoping to kind of bring it up and do a little bit more brainstorming, but yeah, we had, fortunately, we had a very interactive presentation and lots of input as we go. But for you watching this and for takeaways as you go into your own communities of practice and think in your own institutions, these are, I think these are very important questions for all of us to be asking ourselves right now. So number one, what are you doing at your institution to ensure that you're recruiting ethically and not blurring your line of sight to students? Number two, how will you ensure that agents support your compliance with the code? And number three, what recourse, if any, will you have in place for non-compliance? So Gareth and I have really tackled a lot of these points on a number of different levels in the presentation, but as I mentioned, we don't have concrete answers to everything. We're navigating this like all of you are, but I'll reiterate what we mentioned earlier. This is really an opportunity for us as institutions and as practitioners to really be the best in terms of ensuring compliance and ensuring an ethical recruitment process. Remember, recruitment starts, the student experience starts at that first point of contact. Let's really keep that in mind when we're developing our contracts and developing our training processes and developing our marketing materials, because not only is that what has an impact on the student in terms of brand, in terms of image, but it's going to really go a long way in terms of ensuring that a student feels supported and to ensure that they're receiving truthful and transparent information all the way along. So that's my 2 cents for thank you all for joining. I'll let Gareth say his final words. We hope it's been informative, and please reach out if you have any questions in the future.
Yeah, just thanks to everyone watching. Thanks to everyone who attended our presentation at the symposium at VCC. It was a very engaging discussion, and I think at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and we have a very collaborative group here in British Columbia. And I would just encourage everyone to continue chatting with one another, sharing best practices, because I think we live in a wonderful province. We have some fantastic institutions with great programs, and I don't think there's any reason we should be concerned that students don't want to study here. So as long as we keep that these lines of sight, we're going to do very well. So thanks to everyone. Thanks, Daniel, for collaborating on this. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.